Hi, I'm Rear Admiral Owen Swart of the Federation Starship Dauntless, and I'm here today to talk about Star Trek Apologetics. Now, you may have watched my video a couple of months ago. It was an hour-long thing on the economics of Star Trek, in which I began my talk discussing exactly this. What is Star Trek Apologetics? But I'll try and give you a condensed version this time. So, what is apologetics, first of all? So apologetics is reasoned arguments or writings in justification of something, typically a theory or religious doctrine. In this case, it's more along the lines of the apologist, which is usually a term that's used in theological circles, takes it upon themselves to try and come up with reasoned ideas and stories that make apparent contradictions either within the sacred text or between their preferred sacred text and the real world, how to make them fit with each other, how to make them compatible. Whether that's adding in extra information from their own imagination, or whether that's reinterpreting the particular stories in ways that perhaps are more compatible, or whether that's asserting that one of the stories is perhaps meant to be taken metaphorically instead of literally, and so we shouldn't be reading it as a contradiction, that kind of thing. That's the sort of thing that apologists tend to do in theological circles. I think that's a fun game, but I'm not as interested in the Bible or in other sacred texts as I am in Star Trek. But again, we have to define our terms. What is Star Trek? Now, it seems obvious, or at least it may seem obvious, but it's not. There's a little more nuance to it than you might imagine. So, first of all, Star Trek has a defined canon. So canon, again, is a theological term which describes the set of works which is considered the particular sacred text of a given theology. Again, Star Trek isn't a theology, it's just a hobby. But we also have a set work of sacred texts, of documents which we consider to be the official Star Trek. Anything outside of that is not the official Star Trek. So what does that comprise? Well, the most obvious canon stuff is the on-screen Star Trek. So we're talking Star Trek, the original series from 1966. We're looking at all 13 Star Trek movies, so that's the first 6 that had the original series cast, the remaining 4 that had the Next Generation cast, and the most recent 3, Star Trek 2009, Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond. We also have the other series. We've got Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, Star Trek Enterprise, which was the prequel series, and then the most recent series, Star Trek Discovery. I actually wanted to wait until the first season of Star Trek Discovery was over before I began the series, because it would have been a bit more complicated to come up with rationalizations and then find myself contradicted by the next episode of Discovery, which would have been embarrassing. So now we've got a complete season of Discovery available to us, so we can start making drawing some conclusions from what we've learned in Discovery. Now, I'm not going to be focusing primarily on Discovery in this series, but it's unavoidable that Discovery issues will be coming up. So it's convenient to have a nice book-ended version of Discovery that we can work with. That's canon, right? On the other side, we have stuff that's definitely not canon. So that's things like comic books, novels, games, fan fiction is right out. Obviously, anything that's non-licensed can't be considered canon in any way. But even other licensed work, like the novels, like the comics, like the games, although they're officially licensed by CBS, or before then it was Paramount, Viacom, Desilu, or whoever it was who was the licensing body at the time, it's not considered part of the main storyline. It's auxiliary material that explores other ideas, set in the same universe, but it's not canon. We can't treat any of it as being canon because it tends to contradict itself as well as contradicting other canon. So we just leave all of that stuff right out. We don't regard any of that. But there's this grey area in the middle, which, again, to borrow another theological term, I like to call the Apocrypha. So this is material that is, it's not strictly canon, but it's not strictly non-canon either. So the best example of this is the animated series. So in the early 1970s, there was a cartoon series, lasted 2 seasons, it was about 20 episodes in total, which later on in the 1980s, Gene Roddenberry declared to be non-canon. He said, no, we don't regard the animated series as being legit, we can just ignore it. But in the years since Gene Roddenberry's death, Paramount and CBS have been increasingly treating the animated series as if it was historical, to the point where Memory Alpha, which is the premier Star Trek fan wiki online, now pretty much regards the animated series as being part of canon. I'm a little loath to assume that it is, but because it's become pretty much consensus in the community, I'm going to, for the most part, include animated series in canon. The only parts that I can't is any element that's introduced in the original series that hasn't been verified outside of the animated series. So if it hasn't, we haven't seen that same element in one of the other TV shows or movies, then we can probably ignore it and leave it aside for now. But once it's been verified, once it's been confirmed elsewhere, then we have to treat it as canon. There's also a bunch of non-fiction books. I've got some of them here behind me that have been written and published about Star Trek over the years. That includes behind-the-scenes resources like technical manuals, all the way up to lovely picture and artwork books, and various other things. There's even a recipe book. It's on this shelf behind me here somewhere. That kind of material, again, is not strictly canon, as what sometimes happens is material will be published in one of those books that is then contradicted by canon later on. So we can't treat it as canon, but we can look at it as ways of exploring the broader universe. We can look to it for inspiration, for behind-the-scenes information, only as long as it doesn't contradict canon. So as far as I'm concerned, that stuff falls into the Apocrypha category, which is stuff that we should still be taking into account when we're doing the business of Star Trek apologetics, but we shouldn't be looking at it as a primary source. All right, so now that I've defined my terms, I just wanted to give you a quick example of the kind of thing that I'll be looking at in this kind of series. So ideally, what I'd hope for is that you guys, the viewers, will be able to submit questions to me either in the comment section below or via Discord or Facebook or one of the various other ways of getting in touch with me. If you have any questions about the Star Trek universe, you've got something that's always bugged you, something that you think contradicts itself or something that doesn't quite make sense to you, please feel free, ask it. I'll do my best to answer it. In fact, my inspiration for coming up with this series came from the podcast The Bible Geek, which is run by Robert M. Price. Robert M. Price is a biblical scholar and has an encyclopedic knowledge of not only the Bible but various other apocryphal texts. And the whole format of the show is that his listeners write in questions and he does his best to answer them either out of his head or by making occasional references to external documents. And I'd like to try and do a similar sort of thing with Star Trek. So, because this is the first episode, I don't have any questions yet, I've turned to the Daystrom Institute subreddit. So Daystrom Institute, you might know, in Star Trek is it's a repository of all knowledge within the Federation. In the real world, the Daystrom Institute was a website that was put up in the early aughts, late 90s even, it might even be that old, which was a comprehensive database of all kinds of Star Trek information. It had a list of all of the classes of starship that had ever appeared in Star Trek, with what we knew about them from on-screen sources, from behind-the-scenes sources, technical manuals, and wherever possible, if there were gaps left in the knowledge, then they would be filled in based on what we'd seen and estimated and guessed and the kind of thing. It was a fascinating resource for a burgeoning Trekkie who was exploring the internet. But that has since evolved and is now expanded into its very own subreddit, where the kinds of things that I'm going to be covering in this show are frequently discussed. And so there was a post on this subreddit, which was a nice short one. It was posted by a user named Urhan. I haven't asked Urhan for permission to use this question. Urhan, if you're watching, I hope you don't mind, but here it is. Question goes like this. Where is Miranda class deflector dish? Hello there, I just realized that Miranda class has no visible deflector dish. So where is it and how can it go to warp without it? So that raises three important questions. First of all, what is a deflector dish? Secondly, what is a Miranda class? And thirdly, what has that got to do with going to warp? Right, so let's look at the first one. What is a deflector dish? So here I have a model starship. This is a model of a Mark II Constitution class starship. Its base just fell off there. I'll reattach that in a minute. Right, so the deflector dish is this thing here. This round circly thing in the front. Most Federation starships have a deflector dish. It's part of the navigation system. So the warp engines are back here. The warp, of course, the warp engines are the mechanism that allow the ship to travel faster than the speed of light. The warp core is down here in this cylindrical section here, the secondary hull, and these long things here are the warp nacelles, which create the energy field that allow it to travel faster than the speed of light. But now, if you think about it, if you're traveling faster than the speed of light, although you've got really sophisticated sensors, which is these things here, they can look out ahead of you, light years ahead of you in space, and allow you to navigate around large things like planets and stars and asteroids. What about small stuff, stuff that's too small to see? a speck of dust that hits you at multiples of the speed of light, no matter how good your shields are, no matter how tough your hull is just going to rip a hole straight through you. So that's what the navigational deflector is for. It's a high energy projector of an energy field ahead of the ship. So think of it like a really powerful spotlight, but so powerful that it can actually nudge things out of the way. So it projects this energy field ahead of the ship. Anything smaller than a couple hundred meters across, it gets a gentle nudge so that by the time the ship arrives there, it's already out of the way. It clears a path. Think of it like a space snowplow. All Federation ships, in fact, pretty much all starships have a navigational deflector. It's a very important part of the thing. You wouldn't be able to travel faster than the speed of light without it. You would simply die. So let's put that back there. And let's look at the second question, which is, what is a Miranda-class starship? Well, it's a starship. Specifically, it's this starship. I have a model of one right here. It was, we first saw one of these in the film Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and it was this specific one, the USS Reliant. It turned out to be a very successful class of starship, although it was introduced in the late 23rd century. That we saw them still in use in the Dominion War in the late 24th century. Although it was slightly different, a few of the details had changed over the years. It was essentially the same design. But now, here, if we take a close look at the ship, now it's quite different to the Constitution class, although it's about the same age. It doesn't have that whole secondary hull where the warp core is. In fact, the warp core sits around there. It doesn't have those nacelles that swoop up behind it. It's got the nacelles that drop down below it. But if you look at it from the front, it's not obvious where the navigational deflector is. Now it's got this thing on top here, but this isn't a navigational deflector. If you look closely at that, you'll notice that that's a photon torpedo launcher. It's got these structures here that are aiming forwards, but again, like the analogs on the Constitution class, those are navigational sensors. So where is the navigational deflector on this thing? Well, they've never actually told us this on screen, but according to some of the technical manuals and various other secondary sources, it appears that the navigational deflector is here, inside, embedded within the saucer section. Now, there's no inherent rule that says that the navigational deflector has to be exposed to space. Although it's the norm with Federation starships, pretty much every class of starship has an exposed navigational deflector. That doesn't appear to be the case with the Miranda class. And there are several other examples that were built around the same time. The Oberth class also doesn't have an exposed navigational deflector, neither does the Constellation class. Of course, the Stargazer was the Constellation class. All three of those appear to have an embedded navigational deflector hidden behind the front of the ship. Now, this actually is the norm for most starships. If you look at Klingon birds of prey, at Romulan warbirds, none of those have exposed navigational deflectors. In fact, the Federation is pretty much unique in having a standard design that the navigational deflector is visible from the front of the ship. So this seems to represent a period in which Starfleet's starship designers were experimenting with that design standard of having the navigational deflector hidden behind the front of the ship for whatever reason. But it seems that they decided that that wasn't the best way to go, so in later classes of starship, from the Excelsior class onwards, they went back to having the exposed navigational deflector on the front. So there we go. I hope that that answers the question. Like I said, that was a post on Reddit, and I'll post a link to that specific Reddit thread, that subreddit thread, in the comments below. So if you'd like to go and see if the other commenters there agree with my assessment, or if you've got something to contribute, that'd be great too. Feel free to post your own thoughts in the comments down below here. Also in the description you'll find a link to our Discord where you can go and engage with me on conversations on this or on anything else really. You're welcome to find me there. You can also look me up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, various other places. Of course, there's one more thing that I mustn't forget, and that is that if you like this kind of content and if you want me to do this more often, which I'm keen to do, but I kind of need a little bit of help from you guys to do it. Firstly, I need those questions. So if you've got anything that occurs to you that you'd like to know about Star Trek, please drop it in the comments, send it to me on Discord or anything like that. And secondly, a little bit of financial support would go a long way. There's a link below to our Patreon where you can throw a couple of dollars every month, and that'll help me clear out some time in my diary where I can put together more content like this and other shows too if you're interested in that kind of thing. Alright then, until next time, SWAT out.